Tonight, we begin with a development that federal policy analysts had feared, tracked, and quietly prepared for. A change that unfolded not over years, not over months, but in a single budget cycle. A single budget cycle that directly impacts over 70 million Americans who depend on Social Security. A single budget cycle that could reduce monthly checks for millions of retirees, disabled workers, and surviving family members. A single budget cycle that is already reshaping how seniors across this country are planning their financial futures. What the Social Security Administration announced this week crossed a threshold that advocacy groups and retirement experts had hoped would hold. And when that threshold broke, beneficiaries and their representatives did not hesitate. They responded with clarity, urgency, and a demand for immediate legislative action. For the past 18 months, there had been signals, not official press releases, not formal legislative text, just signals that federal administrators were preparing something structurally significant. The Social Security Administration has been under budget pressure, yes, but it has been unusually methodical in its pressure. Their internal reviews have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a cadence, that policy insiders have come to recognize. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this spring was that the rhythm went silent. Budget analysts who monitor entitlement programs know the indicators. The abrupt pause in public comment periods, the reassignment of senior actuarial staff, the delay of scheduled cost of living adjustment announcements, the sudden halt in public-facing guidance updates on SSA.gov. All of that went quiet. And whenever the Social Security Administration goes quiet before a major fiscal year deadline, it means something is about to get very loud for the people who depend on it most. Early this week, congressional budget monitors detected what senior aides described as a structural recalibration, including a formula adjustment that had not been applied in over a decade. These are the kinds of administrative moves that federal agencies only deploy when they are signaling something very specific: a permanent benefit reduction, a means testing overhaul, or a wholesale change to how eligibility and payment amounts are calculated going forward. Policy observers did not know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that the Social Security Administration was changing its actuarial posture. And when a federal entitlement agency shifts posture without public explanation, even by a seemingly small percentage, Congress pays attention. Because a 10% change to Social Security isn't just a number. For a retired school teacher in Ohio living on $2,400 a month, it is $140 gone every single month. The warning issued by senior Senate Finance Committee members tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Briefing after briefing described the administration's move as unprecedented in its scope, opaque in its justification, and perhaps most importantly, retroactively impactful, meaning changes that could reach back into payments already promised to current beneficiaries. But administrative strategy only works if the affected population hesitates. America's retirees and disability advocates did not. In fact, the organized response today was among the fastest and most coordinated we have seen in modern entitlement policy history. Here's what we know. Within 48 hours of the announcement, 3 major advocacy coalitions, representing a combined 22 million beneficiaries, filed formal objections with the SSA Office of the Inspector General. These were not form letters. These were detailed legal briefs, documents that advocacy organizations only deploy when they are preparing to pursue full judicial review. Tonight, sources familiar with the internal review confirmed that the SSA restructuring targets payment calculations across 3 specific beneficiary categories, including the supplemental security income bracket that had recently been reclassified for what analysts believe was means testing preparation. Legal advocates moved before the administration could finalize the rulemaking window. They challenged the actuarial baseline. They challenged the inflation adjustment formula. They challenged the demographic weighting tables that were likely revised to reduce long-term payout obligations. In other words, advocates targeted the mathematical infrastructure of the change, the component that would have made it operational and legally defensible in court. This is what made the Senate's warning so urgent. The SSA's move wasn't just administrative, it was legally actionable. It represented the kind of structural shift that could become irreversible if left unchallenged during the comment period. And advocates, understanding that fully, responded with precision, not with panic, not with misinformation, but with documented legal strategy. They didn't file emotional appeals, they didn't hold press conferences and then go home. They hit the actuarial tables, they hit the regulatory justification memoranda. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Congressional researchers now believe the SSA's latest restructuring was designed to test the political durability of the beneficiary advocacy community after years of budget gridlock in Washington. The administration wanted to see whether organized retiree groups would mount a sustained legal and legislative defense, or whether they would simply absorb the change. But instead, the opposite happened. Advocates didn't absorb it. They escalated with such speed and legal precision that even career SSA administrators took notice. You don't get the attention of a federal bureaucracy easily, but today, America's 70 million Social Security recipients did. Economists speaking with financial media under anonymity describe the SSA's recalibration as a fiscal stress test, a way to determine how much structural change the program can absorb before triggering a political backlash. But advocates prove today that they remain both organized and legally sophisticated. Their filings were not only detailed, they were timed so precisely that the SSA's standard 60-day comment window may now be subject to judicial extension. That timing matters because it shows the advocacy community has learned from past battles. It shows that Social Security's defenders are not passive observers. They are active legal and legislative combatants. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the full scale of the coordinated response. The AARP Legal Counsel Division launched a formal administrative challenge, forcing the SSA to respond to every line item justification in the proposed formula change. The National Organization of Social Security Claimants Representatives targeted the disability reclassification tables that had been quietly updated in the last fiscal quarter. State-level advocates operating in all 50 capitals reportedly began documenting localized impact projections used by federal budget writers to minimize visible political fallout. This was not just a policy dispute. This was not just a Washington bureaucratic conflict. This was a battle over financial survival for tens of millions of Americans. This was a battle over institutional credibility, the one thing the Social Security system has struggled to maintain since the 2033 solvency projections began circulating. For every administrative advance toward cost reduction, advocates have countered with something that complicates the legal and political math. Remember, federal administrators thought the post-pandemic economic fatigue would suppress organized resistance. They thought the complexity of actuarial reform would prevent the general public from understanding what was actually changing. They thought the fragmentation of advocacy groups would slow any coordinated response. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Advocacy groups are more unified than they have been in a generation. Public understanding of the 10% impact is spreading faster than any administrative messaging can contain. And the legal framework being assembled right now may produce a precedent that limits the SSA's ability to make benefit formula changes without direct congressional authorization for years to come. What makes this moment so significant and so precarious is that the SSA's latest move happened at a time when both the administration and Congress are under enormous competing pressures. Fiscal hawks want deep entitlement cuts to address the national debt. Retiree advocacy groups want full benefit protection with inflation adjustments restored. Disability rights organizations want expanded eligibility and restored SSI thresholds. Budget moderates want a bipartisan framework that neither side will actually vote for. Washington is balancing these demands while facing a projected Social Security trust fund depletion date that grows closer with every year of political inaction. And when agencies in that position make sudden structural moves, they are not doing it from a position of strength. They are doing it from pressure. They are doing it from vulnerability. The Senate Finance Committee's formal notice, now distributed to all SSA regional administrators, was designed to signal that Congress is not willing to allow unilateral benefit restructuring outside of the legislative process. Committee members said plainly that the SSA's formula adjustment was inconsistent with the legislative intent of the 1983 Social Security amendments. That is careful, precise language for, "You do not have the authority to do this, and we will fight you in court if you proceed." You do not usually hear that tone from the Senate Finance Committee unless something with significant legal and financial consequences is genuinely at stake. Meanwhile, the leading voice for beneficiary protection in the Senate addressed a packed hearing room in a direct, unflinching speech tonight. She said, "This is not a technical adjustment. This is a 10% cut to the retirement security of people who paid into this system their entire working lives." She said, "We will not allow a formula change to accomplish what legislation has refused to do." And she said, "Every day this goes unanswered, another American makes a decision about medication, food, or housing based on a benefit amount that may soon be smaller without their knowledge or consent." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a legislative body that understands just how high the personal and political stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. The SSA's formula change was not an isolated action. Along with the primary benefit calculation adjustment, the Office of Management and Budget also advanced a proposal to tighten the definition of substantial gainful activity for disability applicants. The Treasury Department quietly reduced the transfer timeline for trust fund interest payments. Federal contractors increased the rate of automated eligibility reviews, targeting long-term disability recipients. All of this happened within the same 90-day budget window. When a federal agency moves multiple policy levers at once, it means something larger is structurally underway, and the visible 10% change may only be the beginning. Analysts are now considering several scenarios for what comes next. One is that the SSA is preparing a full solvency restructuring plan to be unveiled before the 2026 midterm elections as a responsible governance narrative. Another is that the administration is attempting to establish administrative precedent that makes future benefit reductions legally easier to implement without congressional votes. A third possibility, the one worrying senior policy analysts the most, is that the SSA is attempting to lock in structural changes before a potential change in federal leadership reverses course. But today, advocates took the uncontested path off the table. They didn't wait for a public comment period to close quietly. They didn't file symbolic protests and move on. They didn't hope that media attention would be enough. They built a legal record that forces a formal, documented federal response. What we are watching now is a test of institutional durability. The SSA wants to see whether long-term fiscal restructuring can be achieved through administrative action rather than legislative debate. Advocates want to show that 70 million Americans will not accept benefit reductions imposed without democratic accountability. Congress wants to prevent a legal and political crisis that could define the 2026 election landscape. And the courts want to prevent a precedent that permanently blurs the line between administrative discretion and legislative authority over entitlement programs. Tonight, we've heard from senior policy analysts who are now monitoring the SSA's response window around the clock. They say the formal legal challenges have already generated internal SSA communications that will be subject to Freedom of Information Act review. They say the Senate Finance Committee is prepared to introduce emergency legislation that would freeze any benefit formula changes pending a full actuarial audit. And they say the SSA's decision to move during a congressional recess is likely part of a broader administrative strategy intended to reduce immediate political resistance. But advocates are not retreating. In fact, advocates are accelerating. Their response today, legally documented, politically coordinated, and publicly transparent, sent a message to the SSA that this change will not go unanswered. And it sent a message to Congress that the American public is watching every detail of how this moment is handled. As the weeks ahead unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly the SSA hoped to achieve through this formula recalibration. But what we do know is that the organized response was timely. It preserved the legal window for challenge before it closed. It placed the burden of justification squarely on the agency that made the change, and it demonstrated that Social Security's beneficiaries are not a passive constituency. What happens next will depend on what the SSA does in the next 30 to 60 days. If they withdraw the formula change, this moment will be remembered as a successful defense of an institution that over 70 million Americans depend on for basic survival. If they press forward, advocates and legislators have already shown they are prepared to escalate through the courts, through Congress, and through every channel available under administrative law. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in years, the Social Security Administration appears to be recalculating, not actuarially, but politically. Washington is quiet, too quiet. And when a federal agency goes quiet after a major policy challenge, it means they are reassessing. It means they are weighing the cost of proceeding against the cost of retreat. Because tonight, the SSA learned something they have perhaps forgotten in years of bureaucratic routine. That 70 million Americans are paying attention. That organized, legally sophisticated advocacy cannot be outweighted or outmaneuvered by administrative timing. And that Social Security, the program, the promise, the institution, will be defended by the people who built it through decades of work and contribution. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. The 10% change has been challenged. The accountability mechanism is now fully engaged. And the tens of millions of Americans who earn these benefits are not going quietly. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase of this defining moment unfolds.